A 6-year-old kid asked for leftover food, so the CEO followed him home. What he saw changed everything. A great love story. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. I missed you more than words can say. This story will be narrated by me, your Mr. Peter. Let's begin with love, prayer, and a heart full of gratitude. Dear God, thank you for this family. Bless every soul watching, heal what's hurting, and fill their lives with peace, joy, and unshakable love. Amen. Thank you for your prayers. They gave me strength. Now I'm back, and I need your support more than ever. Please like, comment, and share this story. Let's rise again, together. Don't leave the story in the middle. Now sit back, open your heart, because this story was made with deep love, just for you. The scent of salt and magnolia blossoms hit Jane Fonda like a memory she'd tried to bury for 28 years. Standing at the edge of Magnolia Bay's weathered pier, her expensive Atlanta heels clicking against the sun-bleached boards, Jane felt the familiar ache settle deep in her chest. The coastal Georgia town hadn't changed much since 1960. The same moss-draped oak trees lined Harbor Street. The same peeling paint adorned the old general store, and the same lighthouse stood sentinel against the amber sky, its beacon dark in the dying daylight. But she had changed. Everything about her had changed. Jane adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, a habit she'd developed during courtroom battles, and surveyed the cottage she'd inherited. Grandmother Maple's house sat like a patient friend at the end of Seashell Lane. Its blue shutters now faded to the color of old denim, the front porch sagging slightly under the weight of decades and neglect. Wild honeysuckle had claimed the white picket fence, and the garden burst with untamed beauty. Cosmos dancing in the evening breeze, morning glories twisted around the mailbox post, and somewhere in the tangle, the rosebush grandmother maple had planted the year Jane was born. The will reading had been brief. The lawyer, a young man who couldn't have been more than 30, had handed her the keys with respectful efficiency. "Mrs. Maple spoke of you often," he'd said. "She was very proud of the woman you became." Jane had nodded, unable to trust her voice, unable to explain that success in Atlanta's most prestigious law firm felt hollow when measured against the love she'd left behind in this small town. Now, as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jane walked slowly toward the pier's end, her steps measured and careful. She needed to see the water, needed to feel the rhythm of the waves that had once soothed her teenage heartache. The harbor was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror, and fishing boats bobbed gently at their moorings, their rigging creating a soft symphony in the breeze. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks. Too many sleepless nights, too much grief, too many suppressed memories rising to the surface. But as she moved closer, her heart began to race with recognition. There, kneeling beside a small wooden boat, his hands moving with the same careful precision she remembered, was Matt Damon Anthony. Time seemed to fold in on itself. 18 years collapsed into nothing. He was older now, silver threading through the sandy brown hair she'd once loved to run her fingers through, lines mapping the corners of his eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. His shoulders were broader, his hands more calloused, but the gentle concentration on his face as he worked was achingly familiar. Jane's breath caught in her throat. She'd known this moment would come eventually. Magnolia Bay was too small for them to avoid each other forever. But she hadn't expected the raw intensity of seeing him again, hadn't prepared for the way her carefully constructed walls would crumble at the sight of his long fingers smoothing wood shavings from the boat's hull. Matt was applying varnish to the small craft with reverent strokes, each movement deliberate and sure. The boat was beautiful, perhaps 12 feet long with clean lines and the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of patience and love. Even from a distance, Jane could see the care he'd taken with every detail, from the brass fittings to the hand-carved nameplate she couldn't quite read. He looked up then, as if sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the 30 feet that separated them. The brush in his hand stilled. His green eyes, those same forest green eyes that had haunted her dreams, widened with shock, then something deeper. Recognition, longing, pain. All the emotions she'd spent 18 years trying to forget came flooding back in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Even the seagulls fell silent. Even the waves seemed to pause in their eternal dance against the shore. Jane's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where a thin gold chain disappeared beneath her blouse. The chain held a small wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb, carved with infinite care by the man now staring at her across the pier. She'd never taken it off, not once in 28 years, though she'd told herself 1,000 times she should. Matt slowly set down his brush, his movements careful and controlled. He wiped his hands on a rag, the simple gesture so familiar it made Jane's chest tighten with remembered tenderness. She could see him struggle with what to do next, whether to approach, whether to speak, whether to acknowledge the earthquake that had just shifted the foundation of both their worlds. In the end, he did nothing but look at her, and she looked back, drinking in the sight of him like someone dying of thirst. The years had been kind to him in some ways, cruel in others. She could see new depths in his eyes, a gravity that hadn't been there when they were young. Life had marked him, shaped him, just as it had shaped her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and unanswered questions. What do you say to the person who was your whole world? What do you say to the love you thought you'd buried so deep it could never resurface? A pelican chose that moment to dive for fish just beyond the pier, its splash breaking the spell. Matt blinked, seemed to remember himself, and took a small step forward. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for his voice, the voice that had whispered her name in the darkness, that had read poetry to her under summer stars, that had promised her forever when they were too young to understand what forever meant. But instead of calling out to her, Matt looked down at his boat, at his hands, at anything but her face. When he looked up again, Jane was already turning away, her composure cracking like ice in spring. She walked back down the pier with as much dignity as she could muster, her heels striking a sharp rhythm against the weathered boards. Behind her, she heard no footsteps, no calls, nothing but the sound of the wind picking up and the distant cry of night birds settling into the marsh. By the time she reached her grandmother's cottage, Jane's hands were shaking so badly she could barely fit the key in the lock. She pushed through the front door and leaned against it, breathing hard, as if she'd been running instead of walking. The cottage smelled like lavender and old books, like the woman who had raised her with fierce love and fiercer protection. "Oh, grandmother," she whispered to the empty rooms, "what have I done? What am I doing here?" But Grandmother Maple wasn't there to answer, and Jane was left alone with the ghosts of her past and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that Matt Damon Anthony was still in Magnolia Bay, still creating beautiful things with his hands, still capable of stopping her heart with a single look. Outside, the tide was coming in, and somewhere in the harbour, a man sat beside an unfinished boat, staring at the cottage where the only woman he'd ever loved was learning to breathe again. Chapter 2. Unspoken Words. Jane woke to the sound of rain drumming against her grandmother's tin roof, each drop a tiny percussion that echoed the restless beating of her heart. She'd barely slept, tossing between the familiar comfort of Grandmother Maple's quilts and the electric memory of Matt's eyes finding hers across the pier. Now, in the grey morning light filtering through lace curtains, reality settled around her like the coastal fog that clung to the harbour. She was back in Magnolia Bay. Matt was here, and everything she'd spent 28 years trying to forget was about to unravel. Jane padded barefoot to the kitchen, her silk pyjamas a stark contrast to the homespun warmth of the cottage. The coffee tin sat exactly where it always had, beside the sugar bowl with the tiny chip on the rim and the cream pitcher painted with violets. As the coffee percolated, she found herself gravitating toward the kitchen window that looked out over the town. From here, she could see the harbor, the pier where her world had shifted last evening, and beyond that, the winding streets where she'd grown up. Somewhere in those tree-lined lanes, Matt was probably having his morning coffee too. The thought sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, followed quickly by a sharp pang of loss. The kitchen phone rang, startling her from her reverie. Jane hesitated. Who could possibly be calling this early? "Jane? Honey, is that really you?" The voice belonged to Sage Fletcher, her childhood best friend, now Sage Morrison, according to the town directory Jane had glimpsed. Even across 18 years and a crackling phone line, Sage's voice was exactly the same. Warm honey with just a hint of mischief. Sage. Jane sank into one of Grandmother Maple's kitchen chairs, suddenly grateful for the connection. "How did you know I was here?" "Darling, this is Magnolia Bay. News travels faster than Spanish moss in a hurricane." Sage's laugh was rich and familiar. "Besides, I work at the library now, and Mrs. Calloway came in this morning absolutely beside herself, said she saw you on the pier last night, looking like something out of a magazine. She was convinced you were a ghost until old Evander Anthony confirmed it was really you. Evander Anthony, Matt's father." Jane's pulse quickened. How is he?" "Spry as ever, still running that hardware store like he's got 20 good years left in him." Sage's voice gentled. "Jane, honey, I have to ask, are you here for good, or are you just passing through like a beautiful storm?" Before Jane could answer, Sage continued, her words careful but loaded with meaning. "Because there are some things you should know about how things are now, about what's happened since you left." Jane's coffee grew cold as Sage filled in the years that had passed. Matt had married Wren Sinclair in 1965, a sweet-natured girl from Savannah who'd moved to town to teach at the elementary school. They'd been happy, by all accounts, building a life around Matt's carpentry business and the daughter they'd adopted when she was just 3, a spirited child named Indigo, whose artistic soul had captured both their hearts. "Wren was lovely," Sage said softly, gentle as a summer rain, with a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. "She and Matt, they were good together. Quiet love, you know, steady." Jane's throat constricted. She was glad Matt had found happiness, truly she was, but the knowledge that he'd built a life, a family, a love story that had nothing to do with her felt like a fresh wound. "Sage," she whispered, "why are you telling me this?" The pause stretched long enough for Jane to hear the rain intensity outside. When Sage spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because Wren died 3 years ago, honey. Car accident on a rainy night, just like this one. And Matt's been carving boats and raising that girl alone ever since." The words hit Jane like a physical blow. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white against the black plastic. "Oh, God, that's terrible. His poor daughter. Indigo's 15 now, beautiful as her mama was, but with an artist's fire that burns bright and sometimes dangerous. She's struggling, Jane, has been ever since Wren passed. And Matt ... Sage's voice broke slightly. "Matt carries grief like other men carry tools, close to his chest, useful in its way, but heavy." After Sage hung up with promises to visit soon, Jane sat in the quiet kitchen, absorbing the weight of what she'd learned. Matt was a widower. He'd lost the woman he'd built a life with, was raising a teenage daughter alone, and yesterday he'd seen the ghost of his first love walk back into his world. No wonder he'd looked at her with such shock, such pain. Jane dressed carefully in a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, then drove her rental car through the rain-washed streets of her childhood. She needed to see the old oak tree, needed to visit the place where she and Matt had carved their initials so many lifetimes ago. The tree stood in Riverside Park, its massive trunk scarred by decades of lovers' declarations. Jane parked and walked slowly through the dripping moss, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. The oak was even more magnificent than she remembered, its branches stretching like protective arms over the small clearing where she and Matt had spent countless afternoons. She found their carving on the east side, partially grown over but still visible if you knew where to look. JF+MA forever, carved with the shaky precision of 18-year-old hands. Jane traced the letters with trembling fingers, remembering the afternoon they'd made this pledge, how certain they'd been that love could conquer anything. Forever, she whispered to the rain. What fools we were. But even as she said it, her heart whispered back that maybe they hadn't been fools at all. Maybe they'd been the only honest thing in a dishonest world. The grocery store stood at the corner of Main and Harbor, its red brick facade unchanged since her childhood. Jane needed supplies for the cottage, but more than that, she needed to feel normal, to convince herself she could navigate this town without falling apart every time a memory surfaced. Alba Sunshine, her name really was Sunshine, one of those southern quirks that made perfect sense in Magnolia Bay, still ran the store with the same gentle efficiency she'd shown for 30 years. She looked up as Jane entered, her weathered face breaking into a smile that could have powered the lighthouse. "Well, I'll be blessed," Alba said, coming around the counter to envelope Jane in a hug that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. "Jane Fonda, as beautiful as ever. Your grandmother would be so proud to see the woman you've become." Jane allowed herself to be held, to be fussed over, to be treated like the young girl who used to buy penny candy and dream of changing the world. Alba led her through the store, chattering about who had married whom, who had babies, who had passed on, filling Jane's basket with necessities and memories in equal measure. They were standing in the condiment aisle when it happened. Jane reached for a jar of wildflower honey, Grandmother Maple's favorite. At the exact moment, another hand reached for the same jar. Their fingers brushed, and Jane looked up to find herself staring into Matt's green eyes. Up close, she could see the silver threading through his hair wasn't premature aging, but the natural progression of time. Lines mapped the corners of his eyes, speaking of smiles and sorrows, and there was a gravity to his expression that hadn't been there when they were young. But his hands, those beautiful, capable hands that had carved her a dozen wooden birds, were exactly the same. Jane. Her name on his lips was barely a breath, but it sent shivers down her spine. Matt. She couldn't manage anything more, couldn't trust her voice not to break. They stood frozen for a heartbeat, their fingers still touching on the glass jar, the rest of the world fading away. Jane could smell his aftershave, something woody and clean, and beneath that, the scent of sawdust that had always clung to his clothes. "I never forgot the taste of your grandmother's honey biscuits," he said softly, his voice exactly as she remembered, deep and gentle and capable of reducing her to tears with a few simple words. Jane's eyes filled, despite her best efforts. Those biscuits had been their secret. She'd sneak them from Grandmother Maple's kitchen and meet Matt by the old pier, sharing the sweet bread while they planned a future that had never come to pass. She taught me the recipe, Jane managed, before she died. Matt's hand covered hers completely, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture so familiar it made her heart skip. She loved you more than life itself. Used to say you were her greatest blessing. Before Jane could respond, Alba appeared beside them, her eyes twinkling with the knowing look of someone who'd been watching love stories unfold in her store for decades. "Now, Matt Anthony, you stop monopolizing our Jane and let me finish getting her settled in," Alba said with mock sternness. "You'll have plenty of time to catch up later." Matt released Jane's hand reluctantly, his fingers trailing across hers as he stepped back. "Of course. I'm sorry. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Jane remembered from their youth. "It's good to see you, Jane. Really good." As Matt disappeared toward the hardware section, Alba leaned close to Jane's ear. "That man's been carving your face in wood for 18 years, she whispered. "Don't ask me how I know. Some secrets are too beautiful to tell." Jane left the store with her groceries and a heart full of confusion. She drove aimlessly through town, past the old schoolhouse, past the church where she'd sung in the choir, past the cemetery where Grandmother Maple now rested beneath a canopy of Spanish moss. She was heading back to the cottage when she saw the girl. Indigo Anthony sat on the jetty rocks, her knees drawn up to her chest, dark hair whipping in the wind. Even from a distance, Jane could see she was crying, the kind of crying that came from deep places, the kind Jane recognized because she'd done plenty of it herself. Jane parked and approached carefully, not wanting to frighten the girl. Up close, Indigo was breathtaking, all legs and angles like a young colt, with her father's green eyes and an ethereal beauty that spoke of artistic souls and deep feelings. "Are you all right, honey?" Jane asked gently. Indigo looked up, startled, then seemed to study Jane with an intensity that was unnerving. "You're her, aren't you? The one everyone's whispering about, the one who came back." Jane settled onto the rocks beside her, careful not to crowd. "I'm Jane, and you're Indigo, aren't you? I knew your mother a little when we were young. She was a lovely person." Fresh tears spilled down Indigo's cheeks. "Daddy won't talk about her anymore, says it makes him too sad. But I'm sad too, and I need to remember her out loud sometimes, you know." Jane's heart broke for this beautiful girl caught between grief and adolescence. "I know exactly what you mean. Sometimes the sadness needs air to breathe, or it gets too heavy to carry alone." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the waves roll in, until Indigo's tears slowed and her breathing evened out. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting everything in golden light, Jane realized that Magnolia Bay was pulling her back into its embrace, whether she was ready or not. And maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she needed to be. Chapter 3. The Space Between. The photograph fell from the pages of Grandmother Maple's recipe book like a confession Jane wasn't ready to hear. She'd been searching for the cornbread recipe she remembered from childhood when the small black and white image fluttered to the kitchen floor, a snapshot of herself and Matt at 17, his arm around her shoulders as they sat on the pier, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's reach. On the back, in her grandmother's careful script, "Some love burns too bright for this world, but that doesn't make it less beautiful. 1959." Jane's hands trembled as she held the photograph. She remembered the day it was taken. Sage had borrowed her father's camera and insisted on documenting their epic romance, as she'd called it then. They'd been so young, so certain that love was enough to overcome anything the world might throw at them. If only they'd known how wrong they were. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. Summer of 1960, 3 months after this photograph was taken. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, tensions were running high throughout the South, and an interracial couple in a small Georgia town was more than dangerous. It was a lightning rod for violence. Jane could still remember the night everything changed. She'd been sneaking back into the cottage after meeting Matt at their secret spot by the lighthouse when she'd found Grandmother Maple waiting in the kitchen, the photograph clutched in her weathered hands and tears streaming down her face. "Child, what are you thinking?" her grandmother had whispered. "Don't you know what they'll do to you?" To him? "Don't you remember what happened to the Morrison boy in Valdosta?" Everyone remembered what happened to the Morrison boy, found beaten nearly to death for the crime of walking a white girl home from church. The girl's father had claimed he was protecting his daughter's honor, but everyone knew the truth. Hatred needed no excuse, only opportunity. But grandmother, Matt isn't like them. He loves me. We love each other. Love? Grandmother Maple's voice had been sharp with fear and desperation. You think love is going to stop the men who come in the night? You think love is going to protect him when they decide he's gotten too familiar with what doesn't belong to him? The argument had raged until dawn, with Grandmother Maple painting pictures of violence and retribution that made Jane's blood run cold. In the end, it wasn't the threats that broke her. It was the moment her grandmother had collapsed into her rocking chair, looking every one of her 73 years. I can't lose you, child. You're all I have left in this world. Please, please don't make me bury another piece of my heart. Jane had left Magnolia Bay 3 days later, in the middle of the night, with nothing but a suitcase and a letter she'd written to Matt, but never had the courage to deliver. A letter that explained nothing and everything, that tried to make him understand why she had to disappear from his life completely. Now, sitting in that same kitchen 28 years later, Jane wondered if she'd been a coward or a hero. Had she saved them both from tragedy, or had she simply taken the easy way out, choosing fear over faith? The sound of a car door slamming jolted her from her reverie. Through the kitchen window, she watched a familiar figure approach the cottage, tall, broad-shouldered, with the rolling gait of a man who'd spent his life on fishing boats. Orion Fonda, her older brother by 5 years, looked exactly like their father, with his deep-set eyes and skin weathered by sun and salt. "Well, well," Orion said as Jane opened the door, "the prodigal daughter returns." But his smile was warm, and when he pulled her into his arms, she smelled the familiar scent of sea and soap that had always meant safety in her childhood. "Hello, brother," Jane murmured against his chest. "You look good, prosperous." "Fishing's been kind to me." Orion held her at arm's length, studying her face. "You look like success, little sister, all polished and citified, but your eyes—" He paused, his expression growing serious. "Your eyes look tired." They sat on the front porch with sweet tea and shared memories, talking about everything except the one topic that hung between them, like humidity before a storm. Finally, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Orion cleared his throat. "I heard you ran into Matt Anthony yesterday." Jane's glass stopped halfway to her lips. "News travels fast in this town. Always has. Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" "Nothing," Jane said quickly. "I'm here to settle grandmother's affairs, and then I'm going back to Atlanta. This is temporary." Orion studied her with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd learned to read weather patterns and human nature with equal skill. "Is it now?" "Because the way I heard it, you two looked at each other like the world was ending and beginning all at the same time." Before Jane could respond, another car pulled into the driveway, a battered pickup truck with wood shavings in the bed and a teenage girl behind the wheel. Indigo Anthony climbed out of the truck with the unconscious grace of youth, carrying a stack of books and wearing paint-stained clothes that spoke of artistic pursuits. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her green eyes, so like her father's, sparkled with intelligence and barely contained energy. "Mrs. Fonda, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I'm Indigo Anthony. We met yesterday at the jetty." Jane rose from her porch chair, smoothing her skirt. "Of course, Indigo. This is my brother, Orion." The girl acknowledged Orion with a polite nod before turning her full attention to Jane. "I was wondering if you might help me with something. I'm doing a project for school about the history of Magnolia Bay, and Mrs. Morrison at the library said you might have some old photographs or documents that could help." Jane glanced at Orion, who was watching the exchange with barely concealed amusement. Well, I haven't really gone through my grandmother's things yet, but I suppose we could look." 20 minutes later, Jane found herself in the cottage's small parlour with Indigo, surrounded by boxes of photographs, letters, and memorabilia that Grandmother Maple had saved over the decades. Indigo's enthusiasm was infectious. She handled each item with reverence, asking thoughtful questions about the people and places captured in fading images. "Oh my goodness," Indigo breathed, holding up a photograph of the town's main street from the 1940s. "Look how different everything was. And is this your grandmother's store?" Jane nodded, remembering the small flower shop Grandmother Maple had run until arthritis forced her to retire. She grew the most beautiful roses. People came from 3 counties over to buy her arrangements. "Daddy would love to see this," Indigo said without thinking, then caught herself. "I mean, if that would be okay. He's always interested in the town's history, especially the old buildings. He's restored several of them over the years." Jane's heart skipped at the mention of Matt, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course. You're welcome to borrow whatever you need for your project." Indigo beamed. "That's so kind. Actually, I was wondering, would you like to come to dinner tomorrow night? I'm making Mama's famous chicken and dumplings, and Daddy always says food tastes better when it's shared with friends." Jane opened her mouth to decline. Dinner with Matt felt like playing with fire, but something in Indigo's hopeful expression stopped her. This girl had lost her mother 3 years ago and was clearly hungry for female companionship. How could Jane refuse? That's very sweet of you, Indigo. Are you sure your father won't mind?" "Are you kidding? He'll be thrilled. He's been eating my cooking for 3 years now, and while I'm getting better, I think he misses having a real grown-up to talk to sometimes." As Indigo drove away with a box of photographs, Jane realized she'd just agreed to spend an evening in Matt's home, sharing a meal with the man she'd never stopped loving and the daughter who was clearly trying to heal wounds she was too young to understand. "You're playing with fire, little sister," Orion said, having witnessed the entire exchange from the porch. "I know," Jane admitted, "but that girl, she needs something I might be able to give her. And maybe I owe them both that much." The next evening, Jane stood on the front porch of a house she'd never seen, but somehow recognized as completely Matt's creation. The 2-story colonial was painted sage green with white trim, and every detail spoke of careful craftsmanship, from the hand-carved porch railings to the perfectly fitted shutters. A workshop sat behind the main house, its windows glowing with warm light. Indigo answered the door in a flour-dusted apron, her hair escaping from what had probably started as a neat ponytail. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." The interior of the house took Jane's breath away. Every piece of furniture was clearly handmade, crafted with the kind of love and attention that turned wood into art. The dining room table in particular was magnificent, a solid oak piece that seemed to glow with inner warmth, its surface smooth as silk and grain perfectly matched. Matt appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, and Jane felt her knees go weak. He'd changed from his work clothes into a simple white button-down and dark slacks, and the effect was devastating. He looked like the boy she'd fallen in love with, aged into the man she'd always imagined he'd become. "Jane," he said softly, "welcome to our home." Dinner was an exercise in exquisite torture. They spoke of safe things, the weather, the town's changes, Indigo's plans for art school. But beneath the polite conversation, Jane was hyper-aware of every gesture Matt made, every time his eyes met hers across the table, every moment his hand brushed hers as they passed dishes. Indigo chattered about her school project, her art classes, her plans to study in Savannah after graduation. She was bright and funny, and completely unaware of the undercurrents flowing between the adults at her table. "This table is beautiful," Jane said during a lull in conversation, running her hand across the satiny surface. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary." Matt's eyes darkened. "I made it the year after you left. Took me 8 months to get it right. I was particular about the details. After dinner, as Indigo cleared dishes, Matt led Jane around the table to show her a subtle carving worked into the wood grain near one corner, two intertwined birds in flight, so seamlessly integrated into the design that most people would never notice them. "Our symbol," he said quietly, his fingers tracing the delicate carving. "I told myself I was building a dining table, but I think I was really building a shrine." Jane's breath caught. The birds had been their secret. He'd carved her the first one for her 16th birthday, explaining that birds were free to fly anywhere, to cross any boundary, to love without asking permission. She still wore one on a chain around her neck. "Matt," she began, but Indigo's return from the kitchen cut off whatever she'd been about to say. As the evening wound down, Jane knew she should leave, should get out before she said or did something that would complicate both their lives beyond repair. But as she stood to go, Matt caught her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming, for being kind to Indigo. She needs someone like you in her life. She's a remarkable girl. You've raised her well. I've done my best, but some things—" He paused, seemed to struggle with his words. "Some things a father can't teach a daughter about becoming a woman." The weight of his meaning settled between them. Here was a man raising a teenage girl alone, trying to navigate the complexities of helping her grow up without the guidance of the woman who should have been there to teach her about love and loss and finding her place in the world. "If there's ever anything I can do to help," Jane began. "Just don't disappear again," Matt said quietly. "Please, for her sake, if not for mine." After Jane left, Matt stood in his workshop, surrounded by half-finished projects and the scent of sawdust and varnish. In the corner, covered by an old tarp, sat a wooden music box he'd started carving 18 years ago for Jane's 18th birthday, a gift he'd never had the chance to give. He pulled off the tarp and stared at the intricate carving of two birds building a nest together, their wings intertwined in a dance of devotion. He'd never been able to finish it, never been able to bring himself to complete something so full of hope when hope itself had abandoned him. But tonight, after seeing Jane move through his home, after watching her gentle kindness with his daughter, after feeling the old magic spark between them across his handmade table, Matt picked up his carving tools and began to work. Some things, he thought as he carefully shaped a tiny wooden feather, were worth finishing, no matter how long they took. Chapter 4. Beneath Still Waters. The truth hit Jane like a rogue wave, just as she was learning to breathe again. She'd been sorting through more of Grandmother Maple's belongings when Sage arrived unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the expression of a woman who'd been carrying secrets too long. They'd settled on the front porch with their glasses, talking about inconsequential things, the weather, the town gossip, Indigo's sweet invitation to dinner, until Sage suddenly went quiet, staring out at the harbor with troubled eyes. "Jane," Sage said finally, her voice careful and measured, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you yesterday on the phone, but I was hoping you'd tell me yourself." Jane's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Something in Sage's tone made her stomach clench with dread. "What is it?" "I know about Denzel." The glass slipped from Jane's fingers, shattering against the porch boards in an explosion of crystal and wine that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. For a moment, neither woman moved, both staring at the spreading stain on the weathered wood, as if it held answers to questions they weren't ready to ask. "How?" Jane whispered. "I was there, honey. Don't you remember? I was the one who drove you to Savannah that night when the pain started. I was the one who held your hand while you brought that beautiful boy into the world. I was the one who watched you sign those papers with tears streaming down your face." The memories came flooding back, memories Jane had buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they belonged to someone else. the cramped apartment in Savannah where she'd hidden for 4 months, working as a seamstress to pay her rent. The kind woman who'd taken her in, asking no questions. The long, lonely nights when she'd felt the baby move and wondered if she was making the right choice. "You never told anyone?" Jane asked. "Never. Not even my husband. A promise is a promise, especially one made in blood and tears." Sage reached over and took Jane's hand. "But I have to ask, honey, does Matt know? Did you ever tell him about his son?" The question Jane had been dreading for 18 years hung between them like morning mist. She closed her eyes, remembering the last night she'd seen Matt, the night before she'd disappeared from his life forever. She'd known then that she was carrying his child, had felt the early flutterings of pregnancy, even as she'd lied to his face and told him she didn't love him anymore. "No," she whispered. "I never told him. I was 17, Sage. 17 and terrified and so alone." Grandmother Maple was beside herself with fear about the racial tensions, and when I realized I was pregnant, Jane's voice broke. I couldn't ask him to sacrifice everything for a baby we were too young to raise, for a love that everyone said was doomed anyway. "Oh, honey." Sage's arms came around her, and Jane finally let herself cry for the choice she'd made, for the son she'd given away, for the man she'd left in the dark about the most important thing that had ever happened to either of them. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun sink lower over the harbor. Finally, Jane found the courage to ask the question that had haunted her for 18 years. "Do you think I was wrong? To give him up? To never tell Matt?" Sage was quiet for so long that Jane thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but honest. "I think you were 17 years old and scared and trying to do what you thought was best for everyone you loved. But Jane, that man spent 2 years looking for you. 2 years driving to Atlanta every few weeks, asking about you, hoping you'd change your mind and come home. He loved you enough to fight for you, even when you wouldn't fight for yourself." The words hit Jane like physical blows. She'd always told herself that Matt was better off without her, that he'd forget her and find someone who could love him without bringing danger into his life. She'd never imagined him searching for her, never considered that her disappearance might have broken him the way it had broken her. "Where is he now?" Sage asked gently. "Denzel, I mean. Do you know what happened to him?" Jane nodded, her throat too tight for words. She'd spent years working with adoption agencies, using her legal connections to track down information about the son she'd never stopped loving. "He's in Savannah. He's a music teacher, married to a lovely woman named Carmen. They have 2 children, a boy and a girl." "And does he know about you? About Matt?" "The adoption was closed. He knows he was born in Savannah to an unwed teenager, but that's all. I've thought about contacting him 1,000 times, but—" Jane's voice trailed off. How could she explain the fear that had kept her paralyzed for 18 years? The terror that her son might hate her for giving him away, or worse, that he might be perfectly happy without her and wouldn't welcome the disruption of his birth parents appearing in his life. As if reading her thoughts, Sage squeezed her hand. "Maybe it's time to stop carrying this alone, honey. Maybe it's time to tell Matt the truth." The lighthouse stood sentinel against the darkening sky, its beacon sweeping across the water in the same steady rhythm Jane remembered from her youth. She'd come here to think, to find the courage she needed to face the hardest conversation of her life. But as she climbed the rocky path to the lighthouse point, she discovered she wasn't alone. Matt sat on the same boulder where they'd shared their first kiss 20 years ago, his silhouette outlined against the gathering dusk. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression told her he'd been hoping she'd come. "I used to imagine you here," he said quietly as she settled beside him, careful to maintain the distance that seemed necessary for this conversation. "Every time I came here, and I came here a lot after you left, I'd imagine you walking up that path, ready to tell me why you disappeared from my life without a word." Jane's heart clenched at the pain in his voice, the old hurt that 18 years hadn't healed. "Matt, I know why you left," he continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "At least I think I do. The racial tensions were getting worse, and your grandmother was terrified something would happen to you. To us, I understand why you thought leaving was the only choice." "Do you?" Jane whispered. "Do you really understand, or are you just telling yourself that so you can forgive me?" Matt turned to look at her then, his green eyes searching her face in the fading light. "I'm telling myself that because the alternative, that you left because you stopped loving me, would have destroyed me completely." The honesty in his voice broke something loose in Jane's chest. All the careful walls she'd built around the truth came crumbling down, and suddenly she was talking, the words pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. "I never stopped loving you, not for one day, not for 1 hour. I left because I was 17 and pregnant and scared out of my mind. I left because I thought I was protecting you from a scandal that would have ruined your life. I left because I was a coward who took the easy way out instead of trusting in what we had." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Matt went absolutely still, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been grief. "Pregnant," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word. "You were pregnant, with my baby." "Yes." "And you never told me." "I couldn't, don't you see? Your family would have disowned you. The town would have turned against us both. Our child would have grown up with the stigma of being mixed race in a world that wasn't ready to accept that. I thought I was saving all of us from a life of struggle and hatred." Matt stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the cliff and back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. "You took that choice away from me. You took away my right to decide what I was willing to fight for, what I was willing to sacrifice for. You decided all by yourself that our love wasn't strong enough to overcome whatever the world threw at us." "Matt, please." "What happened to the baby?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 18 years of unknowing. "What happened to our child?" Jane's tears came freely now, hot and unstoppable. "I gave him up for adoption. A family in Savannah. Good people who could give him everything I couldn't. I held him for 1 day, just 1 day, and then I signed the papers and let them take him away." Matt sank back onto the boulder as if his legs could no longer support him. The strong, capable man who'd built houses and raised a daughter and carried on after losing his wife looked suddenly fragile, breakable. "Him," he said, "a son. We have a son. His name is Denzel. He's 28 now, Matt. He's beautiful and talented and everything we could have hoped for. He plays music and teaches children and has a family of his own." For a long moment, the only sound was the waves crashing against the rocks below and the distant cry of seabirds settling for the night. When Matt finally looked at her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. 28 years, he said. "I've had a son for 28 years, and I never knew. He's been in this world, breathing and growing and becoming a man, and I never got to see any of it." The devastation in his voice nearly undid her completely. Jane reached for his hand, needing to touch him, to somehow convey the depth of her sorrow for the choice she'd made. "I know I can never make this right," she whispered. "I know I took something from you that can't be given back. But Matt, I need you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought about him, about you, about the life we could have had if I'd been braver." Matt's fingers intertwined with hers, and for a moment they sat in silence, two people who'd loved each other and lost each other and somehow found their way back to this moment of reckoning. "Do you know where he is?" Matt asked finally, his voice steady, despite the emotion Jane could see roiling beneath the surface. Yes, he lives in Savannah. He's a music teacher, married to a woman named Carmen. They have 2 children. Jane paused, gathering courage for the next words. I've been trying to work up the courage to contact him for years. The adoption agency would facilitate a meeting if both birth parents agreed. Matt was quiet for so long that Jane began to wonder if he'd heard her. The lighthouse beam swept over them again and again, marking time in steady intervals, before he finally spoke. Both birth parents, he repeated. You mean you want me to help you find him, to meet him? I don't want anything from you that you're not ready to give, Jane said quickly. I know this is a shock. I know you need time to process everything I've told you. But yes, if you wanted to meet him, if you wanted to know your son, my son. Matt tested the words like he was learning a new language. I have a son named Denzel who plays music and teaches children. Yes. Matt stood again, walking to the edge of the cliff and staring out at the dark water. When he turned back to Jane, his expression was resolved, determined. I want to meet him, he said simply. I want to know everything about him. I want to see his face and hear his voice and find out if he has your laugh or my stubborn streak. I want to know my son. Jane felt something inside her chest crack open, not breaking, but expanding, making room for hope she'd forgotten how to feel. Are you sure? Meeting him. It changes everything. For all of us. Jane, Matt said, coming back to sit beside her. Everything changed the moment you told me he exists. Now we just have to figure out how to move forward. As they sat together in the growing darkness, the lighthouse beam sweeping over them like a benediction, Jane realized that sometimes the most broken things could be mended, not into what they were before, but into something entirely new. Something that might, if they were careful and brave and very, very lucky, be even stronger than what they'd lost. But first, they had to find their son. Chapter 5. Searching Hearts. The morning sun painted everything gold, but Jane felt like she was moving through a world made of glass, fragile, transparent, likely to shatter at the slightest wrong move. She stood at her kitchen window, watching Matt's truck pull into the driveway exactly at 9 o'clock, just as they'd arranged the night before. In the harsh light of morning, their decision to search for Denzel together seemed both inevitable and impossible. How did you bridge 28 years of silence? How did you work together to find the child you'd created in love but lost to fear? Matt knocked softly, though the front door was open to catch the morning breeze. He stood on the threshold looking uncertain, as if he wasn't sure of his welcome in daylight, away from the emotional intensity of the lighthouse confession. I brought coffee, he said, holding up a thermos and 2 cups, and I called the adoption agency in Savannah. They can see us this afternoon if we drive down. Jane felt something loosen in her chest. He was here. He was really here, ready to help her find the son they'd made together. That's wonderful. I wasn't sure if you'd change your mind overnight. Matt stepped into the cottage, and Jane was struck by how his presence filled the small space, how right it felt to have him here among her grandmother's things. I won't lie and say this isn't the hardest thing I've ever had to face, he said quietly. But Jane, that boy is part of me, part of us. I've missed 28 years of his life. I won't miss another day if I can help it. They drove to Savannah in Matt's truck, the conversation flowing easier than Jane had dared hope. Away from the weight of secrets and the ghosts of their past, they remembered why they'd fallen in love in the first place. Matt told her about building his carpentry business, about the restoration projects that had become his passion, about the quiet years with Wren and the terrible time after her death, when he'd wondered if he'd forgotten how to be happy. Jane shared her journey through law school, the civil rights cases that had defined her career, the satisfaction of fighting for justice, and the loneliness of a life built around work instead of love. She'd never married, Though there had been opportunities, no one had ever measured up to the memory of a gentle boy who carved birds in wood and read poetry under starlight. "Do you regret it?" Matt asked as they crossed the Savannah River. "The life you built in Atlanta, the career you chose?" Jane considered the question carefully. "I'm proud of the work I've done. I've helped change laws, helped protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But regret is too small a word for what I feel when I think about the life we could have had." The adoption agency occupied a graceful Victorian house on Bull Street, all columns and magnolias and southern charm. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the director, greeted them with the kind of gentle authority that came from decades of handling life's most delicate situations. "I remember your case, Miss Fonda," she said as they settled in her office. "Though of course I was much younger then, working as a caseworker. It was unusual for a birth mother to specify such detailed requirements for the adoptive family." Jane's hands tightened in her lap. "I wanted to make sure he'd be loved, that he'd have opportunities I couldn't give him." And he was. The Johnsons were exemplary parents. Richard is a music professor at Savannah College of Art and Design, and Margaret taught elementary school until she retired. They gave Denzel every advantage, but more importantly, they gave him unconditional love. Matt leaned forward. "Can you tell us about him? About the man he's become?" Mrs. Whitman smiled. "He's remarkable. Following in his adoptive father's footsteps, he teaches music at 3 different schools in the area. He's married to a lovely young woman named Carmen. She's a nurse at Memorial Hospital. They have 2 children, ages 6 and 8. Jane felt tears prick her eyes. A music teacher. Of course he would be a music teacher. She remembered singing to him during those long months of pregnancy, how he would move when she hummed her favorite songs. "Mrs. Whitman," Matt said carefully, "is there any chance? Would he be interested in meeting us?" The older woman's expression grew thoughtful. "As it happens, Mr. Anthony, Denzel has been asking about his birth parents for the past several years. When he turned 21, we gave him the non-identifying information we had. Since then, he's inquired twice about the possibility of contact." Jane's heart stopped. "He's been looking for us. Not actively searching, but he's expressed interest in knowing about his biological family, particularly his medical history now that he has children of his own. I believe he would be very receptive to a meeting." The paperwork took 2 hours. Forms to sign, procedures to follow, legal protections to ensure. Through it all, Jane felt as if she were floating outside her body, watching someone else navigate the bureaucracy that stood between her and the son she'd given birth to 18 years ago. Matt was steady beside her, asking practical questions, taking notes, being the anchor she needed to keep from drowning in emotion. When Mrs. Whitman explained that they would contact Denzel within the week and arrange a meeting if he was agreeable, Jane nodded and smiled and said all the right things, while inside she screamed with anticipation and terror in equal measure. They were walking back to the truck when Matt stopped suddenly, his hand catching Jane's arm. "There's someone else we need to talk to," he said. "Someone who might be able to tell us more about that day you gave birth." Dr. Leander Pemberton was 68 years old and still maintaining a small practice in a converted house on the outskirts of Magnolia Bay. Jane remembered him as a young man, barely 40, when he delivered half the babies in the county with calm competence and gentle hands. Now he was silver-haired and slightly stooped, but his eyes were still sharp with intelligence and compassion. "Jane Fonda," he said when they appeared in his office that afternoon. "I wondered when you might come to see me." Jane felt her cheeks flush. "Dr. Pemberton, I hope you understand why I—" "Child, I understood then, and I understand now. You were 17 years old, scared, and trying to do right by everyone involved. I've delivered 1,000 babies in my career, but I remember that night like it was yesterday." Matt stepped forward. Dr. Pemberton, I'm Matt Anthony. I'm the baby's father, though I only learned about him yesterday. The old doctor studied Matt with careful eyes. I can see it now. The boy got your chin, your hands. He was beautiful, Mr. Anthony, perfect in every way. Can you tell us about him, about that night? Jane asked softly. Dr. Pemberton settled into his chair with the careful movements of age. He came early, not dangerously so, but sooner than we expected. Labor was hard but not complicated. Jane was so young, so frightened, but she was brave. When I placed that baby in her arms... The old man's voice grew thick with memory. I've never seen love like that, pure and fierce and heartbreaking all at once. Jane's eyes filled with tears. I only held him for a few hours. I was afraid if I held him longer, I wouldn't be able to let him go. You sang to him, Dr. Pemberton continued. Some old spiritual I didn't recognize. He quieted right down, like he knew your voice from all those months of carrying him. The adoptive parents arrived the next morning. Good people, you chose well. But I'll never forget watching you say goodbye to that child. Matt's hand found Jane's, squeezing gently. What was he like? The baby? Alert, strong. He had a full head of dark hair and the most expressive eyes I'd ever seen on a newborn. The nurse said he was the quietest baby in the nursery unless someone was singing. Then he'd perk up like he was listening to every note. They drove back to Magnolia Bay in contemplative silence, both lost in thoughts of the child they'd created and the man he'd become. As they pulled into Jane's driveway, Matt turned off the engine, but made no move to get out. Are you all right? He asked gently. Jane laughed, but it came out shaky. I don't know how to be all right with this. For 18 years, I've thought about him every day but convinced myself he was better off without me. Now, I'm about to meet him, and I'm terrified he'll take one look at me and wonder why his birth mother was selfish enough to give him up and then selfish enough to disrupt his life by coming back. Hey. Matt turned in his seat to face her fully. You weren't selfish. You were 17 and alone and trying to do what was best for everyone you loved. And if he's half the man I think he is, he'll understand that. How can you be so sure? Matt smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since she'd returned to Magnolia Bay. Because he's ours, Jane. He's got your heart and my stubbornness, and that's a pretty good combination for understanding complicated situations. 2 days later, Mrs. Whitman called with news that made Jane's knees buckle and her heart soar simultaneously. Denzel would very much like to meet you both, she said over the phone. In fact, he's quite excited about it. We've arranged a meeting for this Saturday afternoon at our offices. He'll be bringing his wife if that's all right with you. Jane sank into her grandmother's favorite chair, the phone trembling in her hand. He wants to meet us. He really wants to meet us. Yes, dear. And Miss Fonda. He asked me to tell you that he's been hoping for this day for years. He has so many questions, but mostly he just wants to thank you for the life you gave him. When Jane hung up the phone, she sat in stunned silence for a long moment before the reality hit her fully. In 4 days, she would meet her son. In 4 days, she would look into the face of the child she'd carried and loved and given away 18 years ago. The sobs came without warning, 18 years of grief and hope and longing pouring out of her like a dam bursting. She cried for the baby she'd held for such a brief time, for the boy she'd missed watching grow up, for the young man she was about to meet. She cried for the choice she'd made and the years she'd lost and the chance she was being given to make things right. That's how Matt found her when he arrived 20 minutes later, curled up in the chair, tears streaming down her face, clutching the phone like a lifeline. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to fix anything. He simply lifted her into his arms and held her while she cried, his hand stroking her hair, his voice murmuring soft words of comfort and understanding. He wants to meet us, she whispered against his chest when the tears finally slowed. I know, sweetheart. I know. What if he hates me? What if he looks at me and sees the woman who abandoned him? Matt pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. Then we'll deal with it together. But Jane, I don't think that's going to happen. I think he's going to look at you and see the woman who loved him enough to want the best possible life for him, even when it broke her heart to give it to him. Jane leaned into his touch, marveling at how natural it felt to be comforted by him, how right it seemed to be facing this together. They'd created this child in love, given him up in sorrow, and now they were about to reclaim him as partners in the most important reunion of their lives. Outside, the sun was setting over Magnolia Bay, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility. And inside the cottage where it all began, two people who'd lost each other and found their way back were preparing to meet the son who would complete the circle of their love story. Chapter 6. Blood and Water. The moment Jane saw him walking through the adoption agency's doors, she knew beyond any doubt that this was her son. Denzel Johnson moved with Matt's quiet confidence, but carried himself with Jane's grace, long-limbed and elegant, with an unconscious dignity that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. He was beautiful in the way that children of love often are, even when that love had been brief and complicated and marked by loss. His skin was the color of café au lait, his hair dark and thick like Jane's, but his hands, those expressive, capable hands, were pure Matt Anthony. "Mom," he said softly, the word hanging in the air like a prayer and a question all at once. "Dad?" Jane rose from her chair on unsteady legs, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Beside Denzel stood a petite woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Carmen, his wife, who'd insisted on coming to offer support for what might be the most important meeting of her husband's life. "Hello, Denzel," Jane managed, her voice barely above a whisper. You're so much more beautiful than I ever imagined." For a heartbeat, they all stood frozen, unsure of the protocol for reunions 18 years in the making. Then Denzel stepped forward, his own eyes bright with unshed tears, and opened his arms. Jane walked into her son's embrace like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, and when he wrapped his arms around her, she could feel the strength in his shoulders, smell the faint scent of chalk dust and music rosin that clung to his clothes. This was her baby, grown into a man, holding her with the same fierce tenderness she'd felt when she'd first held him as a newborn. "I've wondered about you every day of my life," he whispered against her hair. "Every single day." When they finally separated, Denzel turned to Matt, studying his face with the intensity of someone memorizing every detail. "You have my hands," he said with a wondering laugh. "I always wondered where I got these hands." Matt's composure cracked completely. Jane watched this strong, controlled man dissolve into tears as he embraced the son he'd never known existed until a week ago. "I'm so sorry," Matt said roughly. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I didn't know. If I'd known—" "Hey, it's okay," Denzel said, stepping back to grip Matt's shoulders. "It's okay. We're here now, right? That's what matters." They spent the next 3 hours in Mrs. Whitman's comfortable office, sharing 28 years of stories, filling in the gaps that separation had created. Denzel told them about his childhood with Richard and Margaret Johnson, music professors who'd encouraged his talent from an early age, who'd been honest about his adoption but never made him feel like anything less than their chosen son. "They're wonderful people," Denzel explained, his arm around Carmen's shoulders. "They never hid the fact that I was adopted, never made me feel like it was something to be ashamed of. But they also never pushed me to search for you. They said if I wanted to find you someday, they'd support me, but it had to be my choice." "And did you want to?" Jane asked softly. "To find us?" Denzel's smile was so much like hers it took her breath away. From the time I was old enough to understand what adoption meant. Not because I was unhappy, I had a great childhood, really great parents. But there was always this space inside me, you know. This question about where I came from, what my story was before the Johnsons. Carmen spoke for the first time, her voice warm and understanding. When we got married, it became even more important to him. He wanted our children to know their full heritage, all the pieces of who they are. Children, Matt said, his voice full of wonder, we're grandparents. Miguel is 8 and Sophia is 6, Denzel said, pulling out his wallet to show them pictures. Miguel plays piano like his grandfather Richard, and Sophia, well, Sophia seems to have inherited some artistic genes from somewhere. She's always building things, creating little sculptures out of whatever she can find. Jane stared at the photographs of 2 beautiful children who carried pieces of her and Matt in their faces, their gestures, their bright smiles. They're gorgeous. They look so happy. They are. And they're going to be over the moon about having new grandparents, Sophia especially. She's been asking when she's going to get more family members to spoil her. The meeting was everything Jane had hoped for and more. Denzel was kind, intelligent, emotionally mature beyond his 28 years. He spoke about his work teaching music to inner-city children with the same passion Jane brought to her civil rights cases. He talked about Carmen with obvious adoration, about his children with fierce pride, about his adoptive parents with genuine love and gratitude. But it was the small moments that undid Jane completely. The way he unconsciously hummed while thinking, the way his hands moved when he talked about music, the way he tilted his head exactly like Matt when listening intently to someone speak. I have a million questions, Denzel said, as their time together drew to a close. About your families, about how you met, about what happened between you. But the biggest one... He paused, looking from Jane to Matt with curious eyes. Are you two going to get back together? I mean, you found each other again, and now you've found me. It seems like the universe is trying to tell you something. The question hung in the air like smoke from a blown-out candle. Jane felt her cheeks flush, felt Matt stiffen beside her. How did you explain to your newly found son that love was more complicated than reunion, that finding each other again didn't automatically heal 18 years of separation and different lives? Denzel, Jane said carefully, your father and I, we have a lot to work through, a lot of history to sort out. Finding you again is the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to either of us, but it doesn't erase the time we've been apart. But you still love each other, Denzel said, with the confidence of someone who'd observed them for 3 hours. It's obvious. The way you look at each other, the way you finish each other's sentences, whatever happened between you, it didn't kill what you had. Matt cleared his throat. Son, it's complicated. I'm 28, Dad. I understand complicated. I also understand that love like yours doesn't come along very often. Mom, you never married. Dad, you loved your wife, but were you ever as happy with her as you are sitting here with my birth mother? The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed what everyone in the room already knew. Carmen reached over to squeeze Denzel's hand, a gentle warning that maybe he was pushing too hard, too fast. I'm sorry, Denzel said quickly. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. It's just... I've spent my whole life wondering about you two, and now that I've met you, I can see why I exist. You belong together. It's written all over both of you. They made plans to meet again in 2 weeks, this time in Magnolia Bay, so Denzel could see where his parents had fallen in love, and so his children could meet their new grandparents on home ground. As they prepared to leave, Denzel hugged them both again, holding on as if he was afraid they might disappear. Thank you, he whispered to Jane, for giving me life, for choosing good parents for me, for being brave enough to find me again. Thank you, he said to Matt, for making the music that created me, for being willing to meet me even though you didn't know I existed. The drive back to Magnolia Bay was quiet. Both Jane and Matt lost in their own thoughts about the extraordinary afternoon they'd just experienced. The man they'd met was everything they could have hoped for in a son: kind, successful, well-adjusted, surrounded by love. But his pointed questions about their relationship had created a tension that neither of them seemed ready to address. "He's remarkable," Matt said finally, as they crossed the Savannah River. "He is. The Johnsons did a beautiful job raising him." Jane paused, then added softly, "But I could see you in him, Matt. In his hands, in the way he holds his head when he's thinking. He got your gift for working with his hands, just channeled it into music instead of wood. And he got your passion for helping people, your grace under pressure. When he talked about his students, he sounded exactly like you when you're talking about your cases." They fell quiet again, but this time the silence was comfortable, filled with shared wonder at the miracle of the afternoon. Jane closed her eyes and let herself remember every detail: the way Denzel's eyes lit up when he talked about his children, the pride in Carmen's voice when she talked about her husband's work, the easy affection between them that spoke of a marriage built on friendship as well as love. "Jane," Matt said as they pulled into her driveway, "what Denzel said about us." "I know." Jane's voice was barely audible. "I know what he said. I know what he saw. But Matt, we can't base decisions about our future on the dreams of a son we've just met. We have to figure out what we want independent of him." Matt turned off the engine but made no move to get out of the truck. "And what do you want, Jane? If Denzel wasn't a factor, if there was no pressure from anyone else, what would you want?" Jane looked at him in the fading daylight. This man who'd been her first love, her greatest loss, her partner in the most important meeting of her life. What did she want? She wanted to turn back time and make different choices. She wanted to erase 18 years of separation and pain. She wanted to fall asleep in his arms and wake up in a world where they'd never been apart. But wanting something and being able to have it were two very different things. "I want things that might not be possible," she said finally. "I want us to find our way back to each other. But I'm terrified that we're too different now, that too much time has passed. I want to believe that love really can conquer everything, but I'm old enough to know that sometimes love isn't enough." Matt reached across the truck to touch her hand. "What if we just took it one day at a time? No promises, no pressure, just see what happens when two people who used to love each other try to figure out if they still fit." Jane turned her hand palm up, intertwining their fingers. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." As she walked to her cottage that night, Jane realized that finding Denzel hadn't simplified her relationship with Matt. It had made everything infinitely more complex. They weren't just Jane and Matt anymore, two people with a complicated past. They were Denzel's parents, Sophia and Miguel's grandparents, part of a family constellation that included Carmen and Richard and Margaret Johnson. But maybe, Jane thought as she prepared for bed, complexity wasn't always a bad thing. Maybe sometimes the most beautiful things in life were the ones that took time and patience and careful attention to create properly. Maybe love, like fine woodworking, was worth taking the time to get right. Chapter 7. What We've Built. The word "nigger lover" spray-painted across her grandmother's cottage hit Jane like a physical blow in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd been returning from an early morning walk, her mind still peaceful from watching the sunrise paint the harbor in shades of rose and gold, when the hatred scrawled across the white clapboard siding stopped her cold. Someone had come in the night like a coward, marking her sanctuary with poison that burned her eyes and made her stomach clench with familiar fear. Jane stood frozen on the front walk, her keys trembling in her hand. 28 years in Atlanta, 28 years of fighting racism in courtrooms and boardrooms, and still the sight of that word, that particular arrangement of letters designed to strip away dignity and humanity, could reduce her to the frightened 17-year-old who'd fled Magnolia Bay in terror. "No, no, no," she whispered, dropping her purse as she fumbled for her phone. Who could she call? The police? What would they do besides write a report and file it away? Orion. He'd want to find whoever did this and make them pay, which would only make things worse. Sage. She'd be sympathetic but ultimately powerless against the kind of hatred that crept through the darkness to mark its territory. Before she could decide, Matt's truck rounded the corner, moving slowly as if he was searching for something. When he saw her standing motionless in front of the cottage, he accelerated, pulling into the driveway with gravel flying. "Jane? What's wrong?" He was out of the truck before the engine died, taking in her pale face, her shaking hands, the way she seemed rooted to the spot. Then his gaze moved to the cottage, and Jane watched his expression shift from concern to shock, to a fury so pure it made the air around him seem to vibrate. "Those bastards," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Those goddamn cowards." Jane couldn't speak, couldn't move. She'd known this might happen, had known that returning to Magnolia Bay, that being seen with Matt again, that their reunion becoming public knowledge would stir up the old hatreds that had never really died, just gone underground. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were two entirely different things. Matt was beside her now, his hands on her shoulders, his green eyes blazing with protective rage. "Are you hurt? Did they do anything else? Break any windows? Damage anything inside?" Jane shook her head mutely. The cottage looked untouched, except for the hateful graffiti, but the violation felt complete nonetheless. Someone had stood on this property, her grandmother's property, and defiled it with their poison. Someone in this town that she'd called home, someone who might smile at her in the grocery store or nod politely at church, had crept through the darkness to remind her that some people would never accept her right to love whomever she chose. "Come on," Matt said gently, taking her keys from her trembling fingers. "Let's get you inside. I'll call the police, then I'll take care of this." "The police won't do anything," Jane said, finding her voice at last. "You know they won't. They'll say it was probably kids, that these things happen, that there's no way to prove who did it. Maybe, but it'll be on record. And Jane ... Matt's jaw was set in a line she remembered from their youth, the expression he wore when he'd made up his mind about something. "I'm not 17 anymore. I'm not going to let anyone terrorize you because of me." Inside the cottage, Jane sank into her grandmother's favorite chair while Matt methodically called the police, then the hardware store to order paint and primer. His calm efficiency was soothing, a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. When he hung up the phone, he knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry that being associated with me has brought this ugliness back into your life." Jane looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the guilt written across his features. Here was a man blaming himself for the hatred of others, a man ready to carry responsibility for something completely beyond his control. "Matt, no, this isn't your fault. This is..." Jane's voice broke. "This is exactly what I was afraid of 18 years ago. This is why I left. Some things never change." "Some things do change," Matt said fiercely. "Some people do change. The bastards who did this, they're the minority now, not the majority. Most of this town has moved beyond this kind of ignorance." Before Jane could respond, they heard a car door slam outside, followed by heavy footsteps on the front porch. Sheriff Wade Morrison, Sage's husband, appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Jane, I'm sorry about this," he said without preamble. "It's ugly and it's wrong, and I want you to know that this kind of thing doesn't represent the community we've built here." The sheriff was thorough and professional, taking photographs, asking questions, making notes. But as Jane had predicted, there were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no way to identify the coward who'd struck in darkness. "I'll increase patrols in this area," Sheriff Morrison promised, "and I'll put the word out that this kind of harassment won't be tolerated. But Jane, I have to ask, have you noticed anyone following you? Any strangers asking questions about you? Any sense that someone might be targeting you specifically?" Jane shook her head. She'd been careful since returning to Magnolia Bay, aware that her presence might stir up old controversies, but she'd also allowed herself to hope that 18 years might have softened the edges of prejudice, that love might finally be possible in the place where it had first bloomed. After the sheriff left, Matt disappeared into his truck and returned with a bucket, brushes, and primer. Without asking permission, he began the process of cleaning the hate from her sanctuary. "You don't have to do this," Jane protested, watching him work with methodical determination. "Yes, I do." Matt didn't look up from his scrubbing. "Someone marked your home because of me. The least I can do is remove their poison." Jane made coffee and brought it outside, settling on the front steps to watch Matt restore her cottage's dignity. There was something deeply satisfying about watching him work, the steady rhythm of his movements, the careful attention to detail, the quiet competence that had always been his greatest strength. "Daddy." They both turned to see Indigo climbing out of her truck, her young face shocked and angry as she took in the scene. Who did this? Who would do something so horrible? Matt paused in his scrubbing. "I don't know, sweetheart. Some people who haven't learned to mind their own business." Indigo's green eyes, so like her father's, blazed with righteous fury. "This is about you and Miss Jane, isn't it? About people seeing you together and making assumptions." "Indigo," Matt began. "No, Daddy, don't try to protect me from the truth. I'm not a child." Indigo moved to stand beside Jane, her young body rigid with indignation. "Miss Jane, I want you to know that not everyone in this town thinks this way. Most people don't. This is just ignorance and fear, and it doesn't represent who we really are." Jane felt tears prick her eyes. Here was this beautiful 15-year-old girl, defending her father's right to love whomever he chose, standing up to hatred with the fearless conviction of youth. "Thank you, Indigo. That means more to me than you know." "Are you going to leave again?" Indigo asked suddenly, her voice small and worried. "Are you going to let these bigots scare you away?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Jane realized that Indigo had intuited what she herself was still trying to figure out, whether this latest reminder of the world's ugliness would send her fleeing back to Atlanta, back to the safety of a life built around avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation. "I don't know," Jane answered honestly. "I'd be lying if I said this didn't frighten me. Not just for myself, but for your father, for you, for anyone who might be hurt because of their association with me." Indigo sat down on the steps beside Jane, her young face serious beyond her years. "You know, after Mama died, Daddy was so sad for so long. Not just grieving, that would have been normal, but lost, like he'd forgotten how to be happy. Then you came back, and I've watched him these past few weeks, and Miss Jane, he's alive again, really alive, for the first time since we lost her." Jane felt her heart clench. "Indigo, your father loved your mother very much. I know he did, and I loved her too. But Daddy's not meant to be alone for the rest of his life, and neither are you. Whatever happened between you when you were young, whatever made you leave, that's in the past. What matters is now. What matters is that you make each other happy." From across the yard, Matt had stopped his cleaning to listen to his daughter's words. When their eyes met, Jane saw the same question in his gaze that Indigo had asked aloud. "Are you going to let them win? Are you going to let fear make your choices again?" That afternoon, as Matt finished repainting the cottage's exterior, cars began pulling into the driveway. First Sage, carrying a casserole and her husband's badge of solidarity. Then Alba from the grocery store, bringing fresh flowers and fierce determination. Orion arrived with a cooler full of beer and a promise to sit on the front porch every night for a week if necessary. Others came too, neighbors Jane barely remembered, members of Sage's church congregation, parents of Indigo's school friends. They came not necessarily to endorse an interracial relationship, but to reject the kind of hatred that painted poison words in darkness. "This isn't who we are," Alba declared, arranging her flowers in Grandmother Maple's vases. "Magnolia Bay is better than this ugliness." By evening, Jane's cottage was surrounded by friends and neighbors, the front yard filled with people determined to show that love and acceptance would not be driven out by cowards with spray paint cans. As the impromptu gathering wound down, Matt found Jane alone on the back porch, staring out at the harbor where their love story had begun so many years ago. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her on the porch swing. "I was thinking about choices," Jane said quietly, "about how I let fear make my decisions 18 years ago, and how that same fear is whispering in my ear tonight." "And what's it telling you?" Jane turned to look at him, this man who'd spent his day cleaning hatred from her walls, who'd called in favors to gather a community of support around her, who'd shown her that love could be stronger than ignorance if you were brave enough to fight for it. "It's telling me to run, but for the first time in 18 years, I'm not sure I'm going to listen." Matt's smile was soft and full of hope. "Good, because I'm not 17 anymore, Jane. I'm not going to let anyone, not the bigots, not the cowards, not the people who spread poison in darkness, take you away from me again." As night fell over Magnolia Bay, Jane realized that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in courtrooms or on battlefields. Sometimes they were fought on front porches and in small communities by ordinary people who decided that love was worth defending, no matter what form it took. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to stop running from the fight. Chapter 8. The Leaving Season. Fear won in the darkness of a sleepless night, the way fear always did when courage had no witnesses. Jane sat at her grandmother's kitchen table at 3 in the morning, her suitcase open beside her, methodically folding clothes with the mechanical precision of someone trying not to think about what she was doing. The cottage felt different now, not violated exactly but somehow smaller, as if the hatred painted on its walls had shrunk her world back down to the size it had been when she was 17 and terrified. She'd made the decision around midnight, after lying in bed for hours listening to every sound, jumping at every creak of the old house settling, imagining faces at the windows and poison words whispered in the darkness. The community support had been beautiful, overwhelming even. But when everyone went home to their own lives, Jane was left alone with the knowledge that Target was painted on her back again, and this time it might extend to Matt, to Indigo, to anyone who chose to stand with them. The phone call to her Atlanta law firm had been brief. Yes, she was ready to return early. Yes, she could be back by Monday. No, there hadn't been any complications with the estate, just a realization that some chapters of life were better left closed. Going somewhere? Jane spun around to find Indigo standing in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, her dark hair tousled from sleep, and her green eyes sharp with understanding. "Indigo, what are you doing here? It's 3 in the morning." "Couldn't sleep. Daddy's been pacing the workshop all night. I could hear the floorboards creaking. When I saw your lights on, I figured." Indigo's gaze moved to the suitcase, and her young face crumpled with disappointment. "You're leaving again, aren't you?" Jane's hands stilled on the silk blouse she'd been folding. "It's for the best, Indigo. What happened yesterday, that's just the beginning. If I stay, it'll get worse. People will take sides, and your father will be hurt because of me. You'll be hurt because of me. So you're just going to run away, again?" There was no anger in Indigo's voice, just profound sadness that cut deeper than any accusation could have. I'm being practical. I'm protecting the people I care about. Indigo stepped into the kitchen, moving with the unconscious grace of youth, but carrying herself with a dignity that reminded Jane powerfully of Matt. Can I tell you something about my mama? Jane nodded, settling back into her chair. Mama was the kindest person you'd ever want to meet. Never said a harsh word about anyone, always saw the best in people, always tried to find the peaceful solution to any problem. Indigo's voice grew soft with memory. But there was one time, I was about 12, when some boys at school were picking on me because I was adopted, not just teasing, really cruel stuff about how my real parents didn't want me, how I was damaged goods. Jane felt her heart clench. Oh, sweetheart. Mama found out when I came home crying one day, and this woman who wouldn't hurt a fly. She marched down to that school and had a conversation with those boys that left them apologizing and begging for forgiveness. Then she sat me down and told me something I'll never forget. Indigo pulled out a chair and sat across from Jane, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She said that sometimes the people we love are worth fighting for, even when fighting is scary. She said that running away from bullies just teaches them they can win by being cruel, and that's not a lesson the world needs more of. The wisdom of it hit Jane like a physical blow. Here was a 15-year-old girl sharing her dead mother's counsel, trying to save her father from another 18 years of heartbreak. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was. And you know what else she told me? She said that love, real love, doesn't come along very often. And when it does, you have to be brave enough to protect it. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who believes in it. Jane felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Indigo, it's not that simple. The world is cruel to people like your father and me. Cruel in ways you can't imagine. Maybe. But the world is also full of people like Sage and Alba and Sheriff Morrison and all those neighbors who showed up yesterday. People who think love is more important than hate. Indigo reached across the table to cover Jane's hand with her own. Miss Jane, I've watched my daddy these past few weeks. I've seen him smile again, really smile, for the first time since Mama died. Are you going to take that away from him? Are you going to break his heart twice? Before Jane could answer, they heard the sound of a truck door slamming outside. Through the kitchen window, Jane saw Matt walking toward the cottage, his hair disheveled, his clothes rumpled as if he'd dressed hastily. His eyes found hers through the glass, and the devastation in his expression told her he'd already guessed what the packed suitcase meant. I should go, Indigo said, rising from her chair. But Miss Jane, whatever you decide, please don't decide it because you're scared. Decide it because it's what you really want. Matt entered the cottage without knocking, moving through the rooms like a man searching for something he'd lost. When he reached the kitchen and saw Jane sitting beside her suitcase, he stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. When? He asked simply. This morning. I've got a flight out of Savannah at 10. Matt pulled out the chair Indigo had vacated, sitting down heavily. In the harsh kitchen light, Jane could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his hair, the toll that 18 years and too much loss had taken on the boy she'd once loved. Is this about yesterday? About the vandalism? Jane nodded, not trusting her voice. Jane, we knew this might happen. We talked about it. You said you weren't going to let fear make your decisions anymore. That was before I saw that word painted on my grandmother's house, Jane said, her voice breaking. That was before I realized that being with you means painting a target on everyone I care about. Matt was quiet for a long moment, his hands flat on the table, his gaze fixed on some point beyond Jane's shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Do you remember what you said to me the night you told me about Denzel? You said you'd spent 18 years telling yourself our love wasn't strong enough to overcome whatever the world threw at us. Yes. Are you going to spend another 18 years proving yourself right? The question hung between them like a challenge and a plea. Jane looked at this man who'd loved her through separation and silence, who'd welcomed her back without recrimination, who'd cleaned hatred from her walls with his own hands. She thought about Denzel, about the life they could build together as grandparents, about the family they could become if she was brave enough to stay and fight for it. Matt, I don't want to leave, but I can't ask you to pay the price for my courage. What if I told you I was willing to pay it? What if I told you that 18 years without you was a higher price than anything these bigots could exact? Jane's resolve began to crack. What about Indigo? What about your business? Your life here? Indigo's the one who told me you were packing. She's the one who said I'd better get over here before I lost you again. Matt reached across the table, covering her hands with his. And my business, my life, none of it means anything if I have to live it without you. Through the kitchen window, dawn was beginning to break over Magnolia Bay, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jane thought about all the sunrises she'd missed here, all the mornings she could have woken up in this place she'd always loved, beside this man who'd held her heart for 20 years. I'm scared, she whispered. I know, so am I. But Jane, we're not 17 anymore. We're not powerless kids who have to accept whatever the world decides to hand us. We have choices now, resources, people who'll stand with us. Jane looked down at their joined hands, her smooth lawyer's fingers intertwined with his calloused carpenter's palms, dark skin against light, strength against strength. What if it's not enough? What if we try and fail? Then we fail together. But at least we'll know we fought for something worth fighting for. Outside, Jane could hear the harbor coming to life, fishing boats heading out for the day's catch, seabirds calling to each other across the water, the eternal rhythm of waves against the shore. This place had shaped her, had given her roots that had held strong even when she'd tried to tear them up. Could she really leave it again? Could she really walk away from the only man she'd ever loved? The son they'd just found? The life they could build together if she was brave enough to stay? The phone rang, startling them both. Jane glanced at the clock, 6 in the morning. Who could be calling so early? Miss Fonda. This is Carmen Johnson. I hope I'm not calling too early, but Denzel asked me to. Carmen's voice was warm but urgent. He had a feeling you might be thinking about leaving again, and he wanted me to tell you something. Jane's heart stopped. What? He said to tell you that he spent 28 years wondering what his birth parents were like, and now that he's met you both, he doesn't want to spend the next 28 years wondering what his family could have been like if you'd been brave enough to build it together. The words hit Jane like a benediction and a challenge all at once. She looked at Matt, saw her own hope and fear reflected in his eyes, and realized that this moment, this choice, would define not just her future, but the future of everyone she'd come to love. Carmen, Jane said slowly, tell Denzel that sometimes the most important decisions are the hardest ones to make. But tell him his parents are learning how to be brave. When she hung up the phone, Matt was smiling, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the vandalism. Does this mean you're staying? Jane looked at her suitcase, at the clothes folded with such fearful precision, at the escape route she'd so carefully planned. Then she looked at Matt, at the future they could build together if she found the courage to believe in it. Slowly, deliberately, she began unpacking her suitcase, placing each item back in the drawers where it belonged. I'm staying, she said, and felt the words settle around her like coming home. I'm scared out of my mind, but I'm staying. Matt came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as if he was afraid she might change her mind. We'll figure it out, he whispered against her hair. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Outside, Magnolia Bay was waking up to a new day, and for the first time in 28 years, Jane Fonda was going to be here to see it. Chapter 9. Before the dawn. The message in a bottle washed ashore on a Tuesday morning, as if the sea itself had decided to intervene in Jane's carefully guarded heart. She'd been walking the beach at sunrise, a habit she'd developed since deciding to stay in Magnolia Bay, a way of claiming the morning for herself before the town woke up and reminded her that her presence here was still controversial. The glass bottle caught the light as a wave deposited it gently on the sand, sea green and worn smooth by salt water, its cork still intact after however long it had spent traveling the currents. Jane picked it up with trembling fingers, recognizing it immediately. She and Matt had launched dozens of these during their teenage summers, notes to each other, dreams written on paper and cast into the harbor, a romantic game that had seemed impossibly sophisticated when they were 17. Inside was a folded piece of paper, the ink slightly smudged, but still legible in Matt's careful script. "Jane, I don't know if you'll find this, or when, or if the sea will carry it to some distant shore where a stranger will puzzle over words meant for you alone. But I needed to say these things, and somehow writing them down and sending them out into the water feels like the only way to be truly honest. I'm grateful for every day you've been back in Magnolia Bay, for every conversation we've shared, for the gift of knowing our son and meeting our grandchildren. Even if you leave tomorrow, even if we never find our way back to each other completely, I will spend the rest of my life grateful for this second chance to love you. You asked me once if I regretted the life I built without you. The truth is, I regret nothing that brought me indigo, nothing that made me the man I am today. But Jane, loving you again, or maybe still, maybe always, has reminded me what it feels like to be completely, utterly alive. Whatever you decide about us, about this fragile thing we're building together, know that you have already given me more than I dared hope for when I saw you on that pier 3 weeks ago. Forever yours, Matt." Jane sat down hard on the wet sand. The letter clutched against her chest, tears streaming down her face. 3 weeks. Had it really only been 3 weeks since she'd returned to Magnolia Bay? It felt like a lifetime and an instant all at once. Time enough to rediscover love, not enough time to trust it completely. She looked out at the harbor where Matt's workshop sat silhouetted against the morning sky and made a decision that had been building in her heart for days. It was time to stop being afraid of her own feelings. The workshop smelled like sawdust and varnish, coffee and morning light. Matt looked up from the boat he was working on, a sleek sailing vessel with lines that spoke of both beauty and function, and his face lit up when he saw her. "You found it," he said simply. "How long has it been out there?" "I sent it out the day after the vandalism, the day you almost left." Matt set down his sandpaper and turned to face her fully. "I was afraid if I gave it to you directly, you'd feel pressured. But if the sea brought it to you, you'd leave it up to fate. Something like that." Jane moved closer, studying the boat he'd been working on. It was exquisite. Every joint perfect, every curve flowing naturally into the next. "It's beautiful. What is it?" "A wedding present, for Denzel and Carmen, for their anniversary next month. I thought maybe we could give it to them together. Our first gift as..." Matt paused, seeming to search for the right words. "As whatever we are to each other now." Jane's heart clenched. Here was this man, building something beautiful with his hands while his heart hung in the balance, preparing gifts for the son he'd just discovered while not knowing if the woman he loved would stay in his life. "Matt," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." His face went carefully blank, as if he was preparing himself for another goodbye. "All right." I love you." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for so long they'd built up pressure. Not the memory of loving you, not the idea of what we used to have. I love you now, exactly as you are, in this moment, in this life we're both living. Matt went very still. "Jane." "I'm terrified," she continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "I'm terrified of what loving you means, of what it might cost, of what people will say and do. But I'm more terrified of wasting whatever time we have left being afraid." Matt crossed the workshop in 3 strides, framing her face with his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had started falling. "Say it again," he whispered. "I love you, Matt Anthony. I love your gentle hands and your stubborn chin, and the way you build beautiful things because the world needs more beauty. I love how you've raised Indigo, and how you've welcomed Denzel, and how you cleaned hatred off my walls without being asked. Jane, I love that you sent messages in bottles because you know I can't resist a romantic gesture. I love that you've waited for me to figure out what I want, instead of trying to convince me. I love that you're brave enough to love me, even though it's complicated and messy and might cause us both pain." Matt's smile was like sunrise breaking over the harbor. "Are you finished? Number, I love that you're going to ask me to marry you, and I love that I'm going to say yes." For a heartbeat, Matt looked stunned. Then he was kissing her, his hands in her hair, her arms around his neck, 18 years of separation and longing and careful distance dissolving in the taste of coffee and possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matt rested his forehead against hers. "I was going to do this properly," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I had a speech planned and everything." He pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved with intricate birds that seemed to dance around its edges. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was not a traditional diamond ring, but something infinitely more precious. A simple gold band set with a small, perfect pearl. "It was my mother's," Matt said quietly. "She gave it to me when I was 18, told me to save it for the woman I couldn't live without. I almost gave it to Ren, but something held me back. I think I always knew it belonged to you." Jane's hand shook as Matt slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. "Matt Anthony," she said, her voice thick with tears, "are you asking me to marry you in a boat workshop at 7 in the morning while I'm wearing yesterday's clothes and haven't even brushed my hair?" "Jane Fonda," he replied. "I'm asking you to marry me any way you'll have me, any time you'll say yes, any place you'll let me love you for the rest of our lives." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, yes." They drove to Denzel's house in Savannah that afternoon, the wooden boat secured in the back of Matt's truck, both of them giddy with the newness of being engaged, of having a future to plan together. Jane kept looking at her ring, marveling at how right it felt on her finger, how natural it seemed to be wearing Matt's mother's pearl. Denzel and Carmen were in their backyard, watching their children play on a swing set that looked suspiciously like Matt's handiwork. When they saw Jane and Matt approaching hand in hand, Carmen's face lit up with understanding. "Finally," she said, jumping up to embrace them both. "I was beginning to think you two were never going to figure it out." Denzel was more subtle, but no less pleased, studying their joined hands and his father's face with the satisfied expression of someone whose matchmaking efforts had finally borne fruit. "So," he said casually, "when's the wedding?" Jane and Matt looked at each other, realizing they hadn't discussed any of the practical details. When would they marry? Where? How do you plan a wedding when you're both in your 30s, when you have a son and grandchildren, when half the town supports your love and the other half might not? "Soon," Jane said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We've already waited 28 years. Why wait any longer?" "Christmas," Matt said suddenly. Christmas Eve, when everything is about love and family and new beginnings. Jane felt her heart swell. Christmas Eve in Magnolia Bay, surrounded by the people who'd supported them, celebrating love that had survived separation and time and the ugliness of the world. Perfect, she said, and meant it. As they presented Denzel and Carmen with the boat, which Carmen promptly christened Second Chances, Jane realized that her life was finally falling into place. Not the life she'd planned as a 17-year-old girl, not the life she'd built in Atlanta as armor against heartbreak, but a life that was richer and more complex and more beautiful than anything she'd dared imagine. That night, as she and Matt walked the pier where their story had begun 20 years ago, Jane felt the last of her fear dissolve into the salt air. No regrets? Matt asked, as if reading her thoughts. Jane looked at the town spread out before them, the lights twinkling in cottage windows, the harbor reflecting the stars. She thought about the challenges they'd still face, the small minds they'd still have to contend with, the work of building a life together after so many years apart. None, she said, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like coming home. Chapter 10. When Hearts Remember. The wooden music box sat on Jane's kitchen table like a prayer finally answered. Christmas Eve morning had dawned crisp and clear over Magnolia Bay, the kind of perfect winter day that made the whole world look like it had been dusted with magic. But it was the music box, completed at last, after 28 years of waiting, that made Jane's wedding day feel like a miracle. Matt had left it for her to find when she woke up, along with a note in his careful script. Some things are worth finishing, no matter how long they take. Today, we finish what we started when we were 17. Forever yours, Emmy. The box was exquisite, carved from the same dark wood Matt had used for their dining room table. 2 birds perched on its lid, wings intertwined in an eternal dance, their bodies smooth as silk from his patient sanding. When Jane lifted the lid, a melody spilled out. The Way You Look Tonight, the song that had been playing on Sage's radio the first time Matt had kissed her under the lighthouse stars. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was their old photograph, the one that had fallen from Grandmother Maple's recipe book, and beneath it, a letter in faded ink. Jane's hands trembled as she recognized her own teenage handwriting, the letter she'd written to Matt the night before she'd left Magnolia Bay 28 years ago, but had never found the courage to deliver. My dearest Matt, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Please don't try to find me. Please don't hate me for being too much of a coward to say goodbye to your face. I love you more than my own life, which is exactly why I have to leave. I'm pregnant, and I'm scared, and I don't know how to be brave enough for both of us. Grandmother says the world will hurt us for loving each other, and I can't bear the thought of you being hurt because of me. I can't bear the thought of our child growing up in a world that will see them as wrong simply for existing. I know you'll think I don't trust you, don't trust our love, but Matt, I trust you with everything I am. I just don't trust the world to let us be happy. Maybe someday things will be different. Maybe someday I'll be brave enough to come home to you. I will love you forever, even if forever has to be from far away. Always yours, Jane. He kept it, Jane whispered to the empty kitchen. All these years he kept the letter I never sent. The back door opened, and Sage bustled in carrying an armful of magnolia branches and wearing the expression of a woman with a wedding to orchestrate. Oh, good, you found it, Sage said, spotting the music box. That man's been working on that thing for weeks, muttering about getting the melody just right. Now, come on, bride, we've got work to do. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Jane's cottage filled with women, Sage, Alba, Carmen, even Indigo, who'd appointed herself maid of honor with the solemnity of someone taking on a sacred duty. They arranged flowers, pressed Jane's grandmother's wedding dress, which fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this day, and shared stories that wove the morning into something magical. "Your grandmother would be so proud," Alba said, fastening the pearl buttons up Jane's back. "She loved that boy, you know, worried about you both, but loved him just the same." Through the cottage windows, Jane could see the town preparing for the evening ceremony. White lights twinkled in the live oak trees around the pier, and someone, probably Orion, had strung magnolia garlands between the lamp posts. Half the town had volunteered to help with the wedding, from the ladies' auxiliary providing flowers to the fishing crews who'd cleaned and decorated the pier. "Nervous?" Carmen asked, adjusting Jane's veil, a simple piece of antique lace that had belonged to Matt's mother. "Terrified," Jane admitted. "Not about marrying Matt. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, but about all of this. About being the center of attention when some people still aren't sure they approve." Indigo looked up from the flowers she was arranging. "Miss Jane, do you know what Daddy told me this morning?" Jane shook her head. "He said that love isn't something you do in private to make other people comfortable. He said love is something you declare to the world because the world needs more examples of what's possible when people choose each other over fear. The wisdom of it, from a man who'd learned to be brave, delivered by a daughter who understood the power of love, nearly undid Jane completely. Your father is a very smart man." "Yes, he is. And he's about to marry the smartest woman in Georgia, so their children better watch out." Jane laughed through her tears. "You mean grandchildren, don't you?" "I mean all of us," Indigo said with a grin. "We're all your children now, Miss Jane. That's how families work." As the sun began to set, painting the harbor in shades of rose and gold, Jane walked from her cottage to the pier on Orion's steady arm. The sight that greeted her took her breath away. The pier had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Magnolia branches formed an archway at the water's end, their creamy blooms glowing in the string lights that turned the whole harbor into a constellation. Chairs borrowed from the church and general store held what looked like half of Magnolia Bay. Faces both familiar and new turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright joy. But it was Matt, standing at the end of the pier in a dark suit that made his eyes look like sea glass, who made Jane's knees go weak with love and certainty. Denzel stood beside him as best man, young Miguel and Sophia as ring-bearer and flower girl, 3 generations united in this moment of new beginning. The ceremony was simple, officiated by the Methodist minister who'd baptized half the town and blessed by a community that had chosen love over fear. Jane heard her own voice speaking vows that came from her heart rather than any book, promising to love Matt through whatever challenges the world might throw at them, to build a family with him that would be a testament to the power of choosing each other again and again. When Matt slipped his father's wedding band onto her finger to join his mother's pearl, Jane felt the last piece of her heart click into place. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said with a smile, and Matt did, thoroughly and tenderly, while the assembled crowd cheered and Miguel played "Here Comes the Bride" on his tiny violin. The reception was held in the town square, with tables borrowed from the fish camp and food contributed by every family in attendance. Jane danced with her new husband under the stars, marveling at how right it felt to be held by him in front of the whole world, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. "Any regrets?" Matt whispered against her ear as they swayed to music provided by Denzel's guitar and Carmen's sweet soprano voice. Jane looked around at the faces surrounding them, Sage beaming with satisfaction, Alba wiping away happy tears, Orion deep in conversation with Dr. Pemberton, Indigo teaching Miguel and Sophia the electric slide. Even Sheriff Morrison was there with his wife, standing guard over their happiness with the authority of his badge and the blessing of the community. "Only one," Jane said, and felt Matt stiffen slightly in her arms. "I regret that it took us 28 years to get here. I regret all the Christmas mornings we missed, all the Sunday dinners, all the ordinary moments we lost to fear." Matt spun her gently, bringing her back into his arms. "But we're here now. We have all the Christmas mornings and Sunday dinners ahead of us." "Yes," Jane said, her heart so full it felt like it might overflow. "We have the rest of our lives." Later, after the last guest had gone home and the pier had been cleaned and the lights had been packed away, Jane and Matt sat in their boat, the one he'd been working on that first night she'd seen him again, floating in the calm harbour under a sky full of stars. "Mrs. Anthony," Matt said, testing out her new name like wine on his tongue. "Mr. Anthony," Jane replied, settling against his shoulder with a contentment so deep it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. "What are you thinking about?" Jane looked back at the town where they'd fallen in love as teenagers, where they'd found each other again as adults, where they'd been married surrounded by a community that had chosen to celebrate love in all its forms. "I'm thinking about Grandmother Maple," she said softly, "about how she was so afraid the world would hurt us that she nearly cost us everything, and I'm thinking about how the world did hurt us, but we survived it. We're stronger than she thought, stronger than I thought." "The world's changing," Matt said, his voice full of quiet hope. "Maybe not fast enough, maybe not everywhere, but it's changing. Our grandchildren won't have to be afraid of love the way we were." Jane smiled, thinking of Miguel and Sophia, of the family they were building, of the love story they would tell their descendants. "Some love stories," she said, "are worth waiting a lifetime to finish." Matt kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "Good thing we have forever now." Above them, the lighthouse beam swept across the water in its eternal rhythm, a beacon guiding lost souls home. And in a small boat in Magnolia Bay, two people who'd learned that love could survive separation and time and the ugliness of the world held each other close and watched the stars wheel overhead, finally, completely, perfectly home. The end.